Hey guys, this is just a quick introductory video to PL SQL that we did for our Information Management 2 module. So Ben and Owen are going to discuss a bit about PL SQL, and then Adam, Jordan and Abraham are going to discuss triggers in SQL. I made the video, I hope you guys enjoy it.
So what does PL/SQL add to SQL? It allows users to avail of its block-structured format in order to execute multiple commands or statements at a time. This is useful when a user needs to execute a series of commands more than once, as a user can simply call a function whenever needed instead of manually inputting statements on SQL. The PL/SQL structure is similar to many procedural languages, and so it provides the functionality of looping with for and while statements, and branching with if-then and else-if statements, to name a few. This procedural structure also adds the ability to declare variables, define cursors to parse through data one row at a time, and triggers, which we'll explain in greater detail later in the presentation. PL/SQL also adds exception and error handling using a separate exception block to handle any raised exceptions or errors defined by the user. Also, for the Oracle implementation of PL/SQL, all applications written can run on any operating system where the database runs. You could even write libraries to reuse in different environments.
Procedures allow complex operations to be completed. They can receive parameters both as input and/or outputs. An example of a procedure might be the application of a discount to a product range. The procedure could take in a discount amount and a minimum price and then apply the discount to any products whose current price is above the threshold. Functions, meanwhile, are used to return values. These must be called within an executable statement, as they cannot exist as standalone statements. Functions could be used, for example, for finding the minimum of a series of values. With the structure of PL/SQL, a database user need not worry about checking for errors after every operation on the database. By declaring some handling in the event of exceptions, they have provided cover which can undertake sensible action to remedy errors. The structure of a PL/SQL block takes the following form. The declaration section is used to create variables or declare constants which will be used in the execution of the block. In this example, the discount amount is a variable which takes the form of a user inputted amount. The minimum price is a constant, with the attention that this value should never change. The begin tag indicates the start of executable statements. From within this section, other procedures and functions can be called to build a more complex operation. In this example, the code calls the apply discount procedure using the inputs min price and discount. The exceptions tag is used to show what to do in the case of an exception or error occurs in the regular operation of your program. In this example, the database is simply rolled back in the case of any exceptions occurring. However, the programmer can also define different procedures for individual exceptions as appropriate. The end tag indicates the end of your executable statements. If followed by a slash, as in this case, then the block will be executed.
Hi, today I would like to talk about introduction to triggers. So a trigger is somehow similar to stored procedures. A trigger is stored in the database that includes SQL and PL or SQL or Java statements to run as a unit and can be invoked. Can invoke stored procedures. However, procedures and triggers differ in the way that they are invoked, how they are invoked. A procedure is explicitly run by a user, application, or trigger. Triggers, on the other hand, are implicitly fired by Oracle when a triggering event occurs, no matter which user is connected or which application is being used. We can write triggers that fire whenever one of the following operations occurs: a DML statements that modify data in a table, insert, update, delete. DDL statements issued either by a particular schema or user or by any schema or user in the database. System events such as startup, shutdown, and error messages, and user events such as logon and logoff. Both of these events are classified as database events. So the figure beside shows a database application with some SQL statements that are implicitly firing several triggers stored in the database. Notice that the database stores triggers separately from their associated tables. A trigger has three basic parts: a triggering event or statement, a trigger restriction, and a trigger action. So a trigger event or statement is an SQL statement, database event, or user event that causes a trigger to fire, while a trigger restriction specifies a Boolean expression that must be true for the trigger to fire. The trigger action is not run if the trigger restriction evaluates to false or unknown. A trigger action is a procedure that contains SQL statements and code to be run when and only when a triggering statement is issued and a trigger restriction evaluates to true. Triggers supplement the standard capabilities of Oracle to provide highly customized database management system. For example, a trigger can restrict DML operations against a table to those issued during regular business hours. Some of other functions of triggers includes automatically generating derived column values, prevent invalid transactions, enforcing complex security authorizations, referential integrity across nodes in a distributed database, complex business rules. It can also allow us to provide transparent event logging, auditing, and maintain asynchronous table replicates. We can gather statistics on table access using triggers and modify table data when DML statements are issued when against views. Using triggers, we can also publish information about database events, user events, and SQL statements to subscribing applications. Thank you. So now I would like to talk about the management of triggers. When a statement in a trigger body causes another trigger to fire, the triggers are said to be cascading. A relational database does not guarantee the order of rows processed by a SQL statement. Therefore, do not create triggers that depend on the order in which rows are processed. Oracle stores PL or SQL triggers in compiled form, just like other storing other procedures. When a create trigger statement commits, the compiled PL or SQL code is stored in the database, and the source code of the trigger is flushed from the shared pool. So, in Oracle database, triggers are run internally using the same steps for subprogram execution. The only subtle difference is that a user with privilege has the right to fire a trigger. Aside from that, triggers are validated and run the same way as stored subprograms. And as for the dependency maintenance of triggers, like procedures, triggers depend on reference objects. Oracle database automatically manages the dependencies of a trigger on schema objects referenced in its trigger action. They are inserted in the data dictionary. Thank you.
A URL we have chosen for database triggers comes from essentialsql.com. We chose this URL because it concisely describes database triggers, explains after and instead of triggers, and gives uses for triggers. The after trigger runs after a DML action completes. This means that both the DML action and the trigger execute. This is useful if there is some SQL code that you need to run every time a certain type of query is executed, such as an update statement. The instead of trigger overrides the DML action. The instead of trigger runs in place of the DML action. This is useful if there are some types of queries that you want fine-grained control over, and you want certain things to happen each time someone attempts to execute one of these queries.
We found this link on sqltutorial.org and is an overall comprehensive guide to SQL triggers. What made us choose this link for trigger commands was its explanation of the for each row and for each statement aspect of a trigger. It explained to us the difference between row level and statement level triggers. How a row level will execute once for each row affected by an update statement, and if none are affected, then it won't execute at all. However, a statement level will execute once and only once, regardless of the number of rows affected, and if none are affected, it will still execute once and only once. The guide also goes through the syntax of creating a trigger, the different types of triggers such as delete and modify triggers, and also explains in detail situations where triggers are most commonly used and are best used.